What are some real but crazy facts that could save your life? Story 1. So, there I was hiking solo because apparently I thought I was Bear Grylls. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I slipped, twisted my ankle, and surprise, a mama bear and her cub showed up. Fun fact, bears don't love surprise guests. She started charging, and my brain decided to channel its inner genius. I remembered reading that bears hate sudden noises, so I pulled out my phone and blasted Baby Shark at full volume. I don't know if she hated the song or just felt secondhand embarrassment for me, but she stopped dead, turned, and walked off like, I don't need this. Moral of the story, the song that annoyed you in 2018 might just save your life in the woods. Story 2. If you're ever kidnapped, and let's hope you're not, here's something most people don't know. Car trunks have emergency release levers. I learned this from one of those late-night internet rabbit holes, and guess what? It came in handy. A few years back, I got into a sketchy rideshare. Don't judge me, it was cheap. And the guy decided to take a shortcut. Suddenly, I was in the trunk, wondering how I got into a real-life thriller movie. Remembering the lever, I felt around in the dark and bam! There it was. I popped the trunk, rolled out onto the highway like some action hero, and flagged down help. The guy sped off, and I ended up explaining the whole thing to a very confused cop. Moral? Always check your rideshare license plate, and maybe practice your highway rolling skills, just in case. Story 3. There's a reason you shouldn't leave your drink unattended, and I learned it the hard way. At a party, I stepped away for like 2 seconds, and when I came back, something tasted off. I started feeling weird, like my brain had been turned down to low power mode. Luckily, a friend noticed and asked what was wrong. Here's where it gets wild. Instead of panicking, he handed me a straw and said, "Start chugging water through this." Apparently, sipping through a straw slows down the absorption of certain substances because of how it forces your throat to process liquid. Who knew? After a very awkward ER visit, the doctor said it probably bought me enough time to avoid something worse. Edit. Turns out the guy who spiked my drink got caught trying to pull the same stunt later. He's now enjoying an all-expenses-paid stay in jail. Story 4. Once, I got trapped in an elevator with a coworker I couldn't stand. 10 minutes in, he started freaking out, like full-on hyperventilating. Here's the kicker. I remembered reading somewhere that chewing gum can help with anxiety because it tricks your brain into thinking you're eating, which is apparently calming. I happened to have gum in my pocket, so I handed him a piece. It didn't work instantly, but after a few minutes, he was calm enough to breathe normally. The elevator was fixed after about an hour, but he spent the rest of the day telling everyone I saved his life. Did I mention he's my boss now? Every time I get a raise, I wonder if it's because I had gum that day. Story 5. Have you ever wondered if you could survive falling into freezing water? Spoiler alert, you can, but you have about a minute to get it right. A friend and I were ice fishing, because apparently we hate being warm. And I stepped on thin ice. Boom! Straight into the water. My friend started screaming, but I remembered the 1-10-1 rule I'd read about online. You have 1 minute to control your breathing, 10 minutes of meaningful muscle use to get out, and 1 hour before hypothermia kicks in. I focused on staying calm, found the edge of the ice, and used my elbows to inch out. It felt like a scene from a survival show, but hey, it worked. The best part? My friend insisted on warming me up with a hot chocolate and enough marshmallows to count as a second meal. Not a bad ending for almost turning into a popsicle. Story 6. A couple of years ago, I got lost while driving through the middle of nowhere at night. My phone battery was at 2%, and I hadn't seen another car in ages. Of course, that's when my car decided to break down. I sat there in complete darkness, panicking, until I remembered something I'd seen in a survival video. If you need to get someone's attention, turn on your hazard lights and honk in bursts of 3. It's a distress signal most people recognize. I did it, feeling ridiculous, and within 20 minutes, a trucker pulled up. He was an older guy, really nice, and helped me jumpstart my car. He said he only stopped because he recognized the signal. So yeah, next time you're stranded, don't just sit there. flash and honk like your life depends on it. Story 7. I once accidentally set my kitchen on fire while trying to cook a fancy dinner for a date. I was heating oil, got distracted, and suddenly flames shot up like I was auditioning for a cooking show gone wrong. My first instinct was to grab water, but then I remembered. Oil fires and water don't mix. It spreads the fire like crazy. Instead, I grabbed a box of baking soda and dumped it on the flames. It worked like magic. The fire went out, my date showed up 5 minutes later, and I had to explain why my apartment smelled like a campfire. The good news? She thought it was funny and even helped me order pizza. The bad news? I still get nervous cooking anything that requires oil. Story 8. Did you know you can use your keys as a weapon in a pinch? I didn't, until I had to. A few years ago, I was walking home late at night, and a guy started following me. He got closer, and I could feel my heart pounding out of my chest. Then I remembered a self-defense tip. Hold your keys between your fingers like claws. It's not pretty, but it works. When he grabbed my arm, I swung my hand as hard as I could. He yelped, let go, and ran off, yelling something about how I was crazy. I don't even care what he said. I was safe, and that's all that mattered. Now, I keep a small self-defense tool on my keychain, just in case. Story 9. One summer, I was at the beach with friends when someone yelled, "Shark!" Everyone panicked and started rushing to shore, but one guy in the water wasn't moving. He was frozen, staring at the fin. I remembered hearing that if you're near a shark, you shouldn't thrash or swim away quickly because it triggers their hunting instincts. Instead, you're supposed to maintain eye contact and move slowly towards safety. I yelled this at him, and to my surprise, he actually listened. He backed up toward the shore, and the shark swam off. Turns out it wasn't even a shark. It was a dolphin. But hey, better safe than sorry. My friends still call me Shark Whisperer, and I've leaned into it. Story 10. Once, I almost caused an airplane emergency because of a stupid pair of headphones. Mid-flight, I plugged them into my seat's jack, but they didn't work. I kept fiddling with the cord, frustrated, until smoke started coming from the port. My headphones had a short in the wire, and they were heating up fast. I panicked and yanked them out, but by then, people around me had noticed the smoke. A flight attendant rushed over and hit me with the "what the freak is going on" face. I explained, and she calmly grabbed a fire extinguisher, ready to spray my seat. Luckily, it didn't come to that. I'd unplugged everything just in time. Edit. The airline emailed me afterward to say they were investigating the matter. I've never flown with those headphones again, and now I always check my electronics before boarding. Lesson learned. Never underestimate the power of faulty tech. Story 11. A few years ago, I went on a snorkeling trip, thinking it'd be a chill day. About 10 minutes into swimming, I noticed a massive jellyfish floating nearby. I started to swim away, but before I could get far, I felt a sharp sting on my leg. Yep, I got zapped. The pain was excruciating, like someone had dragged a live wire across my skin. The guide rushed over and told me to pour vinegar on the sting. Apparently, vinegar neutralizes the venom. Luckily, someone had a bottle in their bag. Who brings vinegar to the beach? And within minutes, the pain started to fade. I spent the rest of the day covered in vinegar, smelling like a salad. But hey, at least I didn't end up in the hospital. Moral of the story, jellyfish don't care about your vacation plans. Story 12. I was once stuck in a massive pileup on the highway during a snowstorm. Cars were sliding everywhere, and my car skidded right into a ditch. While I waited for a tow truck, I realized my gas tank was almost empty. To make it worse, my phone battery was at 10%, and the temperature was dropping fast. That's when I remembered a random fact. Keep a candle and matches in your car during winter. It sounds ridiculous, but one small candle can provide enough heat to keep you alive in an emergency. I rummaged through my emergency kit. Thankfully, I had one, and found a candle and a lighter. Lighting it in the cup holder, I huddled up with a blanket and stayed warm until help arrived. The tow truck driver looked at me like I was some kind of survival guru, but honestly, I just got lucky. Story 13. Back in college, I worked the night shift at a gas station. One night, a guy walked in, looking shifty. He wandered the aisles but didn't buy anything. My gut told me something was off, and sure enough, he pulled a knife and demanded the cash. My brain froze for a second, but then I remembered a self-defense tip. If you can't run, distract the attacker. So I faked a coughing fit, like full-on choking. He panicked, asking if I was okay, and in that moment, I reached for the silent alarm under the counter. He bolted as soon as the alarm went off, and the cops showed up within minutes. Edit. The guy was caught a few days later, trying the same stunt at another store. Turns out, my Oscar-worthy coughing fit might have saved someone else down the line. Story 14. One summer, my friends and I decided to go cliff diving, because apparently we thought we were invincible. At one spot, the water looked deep enough, but just as I was about to jump, I heard someone yell, "Stop!" A local came running over and told us the water there was shallow, even though it looked fine. He explained how certain pools can seem deeper due to light refraction, and that's how people end up breaking bones. Or worse. We moved to another spot he recommended, where the water was actually safe. Looking back, I'm glad someone spoke up, because we were too caught up in the adrenaline to think straight. Always double-check before you jump, no matter how cool it looks. Story 15. A few years ago, I had a neighbor who loved DIY home projects. One day, he was installing a new ceiling fan and decided to wing it instead of reading the manual. I happened to walk by his house when I heard a massive crash. The guy had wired something wrong, and the fan short-circuited, causing a small electrical fire. He was freaking out, but I ran inside, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and yelled, "Turn off the main breaker!" Apparently, he didn't know where it was, so I found it in his basement and flipped it off. The fire was out in seconds, but the fan was toast. Edit. Later, he thanked me by baking a cake. It was burnt. I guess we're both better off sticking to what we know. Story 16. A few years ago, I decided to try camping for the first time. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend in nature, but I ended up fighting for my life. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside my tent. At first I thought it was the wind, until I heard a low growl. It was a mountain lion. My brain screamed, "Do something!" But all I could remember was that you're supposed to act big and intimidating. So I grabbed my flashlight, stood up, and started yelling, "I'm bigger than you!" while waving my arms like a maniac. The lion stared for what felt like an eternity, before slinking off into the darkness. I didn't sleep a single minute that night, but hey, at least I survived. Lesson learned. Nature doesn't care if you're a beginner. Story 17. Once, while traveling abroad, I got food poisoning so bad I thought I might actually die. It hit me in the middle of a crowded bus ride. Sweating and nauseous, I barely made it to a pharmacy, where I asked for help using the world's worst charades. The pharmacist handed me activated charcoal tablets. I had no idea what they were, but I was desperate and took them. Within an hour, the nausea subsided. Turns out activated charcoal binds to toxins in your stomach and helps flush them out. I made it through the rest of the trip without another incident, though I spent the next week avoiding street food like my life depended on it. Now, I always pack activated charcoal whenever I travel. It's a lifesaver. Story 18. I once witnessed a car accident while driving home late at night. The car ahead of me lost control and flipped into a ditch. I pulled over and ran to help, but the driver was unconscious and the car was leaking gas. Panicking, I remembered something I'd seen in a first aid course. You should never move someone unless there's an immediate danger, like a fire. I pulled the driver out carefully, keeping his neck as stable as possible, and got him a safe distance away. Moments later, the car caught fire. The paramedics arrived, and they said my quick thinking likely saved his life. Edit. A few weeks later, the driver tracked me down and sent me a thank you card with a gift card for coffee. He joked that he owed me a cup, or 10, for not letting him become a marshmallow. Story 19. When I was younger, my dad always drilled one safety tip into my head. If you smell gas, don't turn on any lights or appliances. I never thought much of it, until one day I came home and smelled something weird. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make me cautious. I didn't touch the light switch and instead called the gas company immediately. When they arrived, they found a small gas leak near my stove. The tech told me that flipping a switch could have caused a spark and an explosion. I moved out of that apartment a month later because no amount of rent savings is worth potentially blowing up. Story 20. During a flight, the person sitting next to me started choking. I froze for a second, unsure what to do. The flight attendant rushed over and began doing abdominal thrusts, but the guy was still struggling. That's when I remembered. If you're choking and there's no one to help, you can use a chair to perform the Heimlich maneuver on yourself. You push your abdomen against the backrest to simulate the thrust. I blurted it out to the choking guy, who managed to do it with the armrest of his seat. A piece of food shot out, and he gasped for air. The whole plane clapped like we were in a movie, and I felt like a total genius for remembering that tip. Edit. When we landed, he bought me a drink and joked that he owed me his next 10 birthdays. Honestly, I was just glad I didn't have to explain to someone's family why their loved one choked on peanuts at 35,000 feet. Story 21. A couple of years ago, I was on a weekend hike when the weather turned nasty out of nowhere. What started as a light drizzle quickly became a downpour, and the trail turned into a muddy slip and slide. I'd wandered off the main path earlier. Brilliant idea, I know, and couldn't find my way back. My phone was useless with no signal, and I was soaking wet. Then I remembered something I'd read. If you're lost, follow running water. Streams often lead to larger rivers, which can guide you back to civilization. I found a small creek and started walking downstream. After about 2 hours, I stumbled across a road where I flagged down a car. The driver looked at me like I'd crawled out of a swamp. To be fair, I kinda had. But they gave me a ride back to town. Lesson learned. Always respect the weather and stick to the trail. Story 22. When I was 12, I got caught in a riptide at the beach. 1 second, I was playing in the waves. The next, I was being dragged out to sea. I panicked and started swimming against the current, but it was like trying to sprint on a treadmill. It wasn't working. I remembered a lifeguard's tip from years ago. Don't fight the current. Swim parallel to the shore until you're out of the riptide, then head back in. It felt counterintuitive, but I did it. After what felt like an eternity, I reached calmer water and made it back to the beach. My parents had no idea what had just happened. To this day, I'm thankful I didn't panic and kept my cool. That tip probably saved my life. Story 23. One time I was house-sitting for a friend when I heard a weird buzzing sound coming from the garage. I opened the door to find their water heater making an ominous rumbling noise. Not knowing much about water heaters, I called my dad, who's basically a walking encyclopedia of random knowledge. He told me to turn it off immediately and get out of the house because it sounded like it was about to explode. Apparently, if the pressure builds up too much, water heaters can literally blow up like a bomb. I shut it off, and sure enough, a plumber later confirmed it was seconds away from disaster. Edit. My friend joked that I saved their house but still made me clean up the garage as thanks. At least I got a cool story out of it, and a new fear of water heaters. Story 24. A few months ago, I was babysitting my nephew when he swallowed a small piece of a toy. He started coughing and couldn't breathe properly. I immediately thought of the Heimlich maneuver, but he was only 3, so I wasn't sure how to do it for a kid. I quickly laid him face down on my lap and gave him 5 firm back blows between the shoulder blades, just like I'd seen in a first aid video. On the 3rd hit, the piece popped out and he started crying, which was honestly the best sound I've ever heard. My sister came home to find me a sweaty, shaky mess, and my nephew totally unfazed, asking for snacks. Story 25. During a road trip, my car broke down in the middle of nowhere. My phone had no signal, and it was getting dark fast. To make matters worse, I'd forgotten to pack food or water because I clearly thought I was invincible. Sitting there, I remembered reading that your car is the safest place to wait in these situations. It provides shelter, and rescuers are more likely to spot a vehicle than a person wandering around. So, I stayed put, turned on my hazard lights, and rationed the half-empty water bottle I'd found under the seat. Hours later, a passing car finally stopped to help. Edit. Turns out my car broke down because I hadn't checked the oil in. Oh, about a year. The mechanic who fixed it lectured me like I was his kid. But hey, at least I didn't end up on one of those missing person posters. Lesson learned. Always prepare for the worst, even on short trips. Story 26. A few years ago, I decided to try kayaking with some friends on a calm lake. It was all fun and games until I tipped over, trying to reach for my water bottle. The kayak flipped, and I found myself struggling to get back up. The water wasn't deep, but the panic set in because I got tangled in the straps of my life jacket. Then I remembered something from a safety course. If you're stuck underwater, don't fight it. Relax, untangle yourself calmly, and use your legs to push up. Fighting only wastes oxygen and makes it worse. I stopped thrashing, freed the strap, and pushed myself back to the surface. My friends were already laughing at my graceful flip, completely unaware I was having a near-death experience. Now I double-check all my gear before getting in the water, because I'd rather avoid starring in my own disaster movie again. Story 27. One winter, I was walking home late at night when I slipped on a patch of black ice and hit my head. For a few seconds, I couldn't see straight. Luckily, a stranger passing by saw me fall and stopped to check on me. He asked if I was okay, but I felt fine after a minute and waved him off. Bad move. Turns out, even if you feel okay after a head injury, you should always get it checked out. That night, I started feeling nauseous and dizzy, so I went to the ER. The doctor said I had a mild concussion and could have made it worse if I hadn't come in. Now, I'm the person who lectures others about head injuries whenever someone says, "It's probably fine." Spoiler, it's not fine. Get it checked. Story 28. Back in high school, I worked at a fast food place, and one day, someone spilled grease near the fryers. My coworker grabbed the mop to clean it up, but I yelled at him to stop. I just learned in chemistry class that water and oil don't mix, and adding water to hot grease can cause a fireball. He looked at me like I was crazy, but I grabbed some baking soda from the supply shelf and used that instead. It soaked up the grease, and we avoided what could have been a very expensive mistake. Edit. The manager found out what happened and gave me a $10 gift card as a thank you. Meanwhile, my coworker never forgave me for yelling at him in front of everyone, but hey, at least the place didn't burn down. Story 29. One summer, my cousin and I decided to go hiking in a canyon. We weren't paying attention to the weather, and suddenly the sky turned gray. Within minutes, it started raining, and we realized we were in a flash flood zone. Water started rushing in from higher ground, and we had nowhere to go. I remembered reading that in a flood, climbing to higher ground is your only chance. We scrambled up the side of the canyon, holding onto rocks and tree roots as the water rose below us. It was terrifying, but we managed to find a safe ledge. We stayed there for hours until the rain stopped and the water subsided. Looking back, I can't believe we were so reckless, but at least I know what to do if it ever happens again. Story 30. A few years ago, I was dog-sitting for a friend when their dog started choking on a piece of rawhide. She was pawing at her mouth and couldn't breathe. I panicked at first, but then I remembered a technique I'd seen online for choking dogs. I got behind her, wrapped my arms around her chest just below her rib cage, and gave a few upward thrusts. On the second try, the rawhide flew out, and she started breathing again. The poor thing was shaken. But fine. Edit. When my friend got back and heard the story, she immediately threw out all the rawhide in the house and replaced it with safer chew toys. Now every time I see that dog, I feel like a hero, and she looks at me like I'm the person who saved her snack. Story 31. A few years ago, I was exploring an old abandoned building with some friends. It was supposed to be a fun, spooky adventure, but then the floor gave way, and I fell into the basement. My friends panicked, yelling down to ask if I was okay. I wasn't seriously hurt, but my ankle was twisted, and I couldn't climb out. One friend wanted to jump down and help, but I shouted at them to stop. I remembered reading that in situations like this, you should never send another person into danger. They could get trapped too. Instead, I told them to call for help. The fire department showed up with a ladder, and I was out in less than an hour. My ankle healed, but my pride didn't. Now, I avoid adventuring. in places that scream health hazard. Story 32. I once got caught in a house fire. Well, more like a kitchen fire that spiraled out of control. My roommate had left a pan of oil on the stove and forgot about it, and by the time we noticed, flames were licking the cabinets. The smoke alarm was blaring, and my first instinct was to grab a towel and try to fan it out. Thankfully, I stopped myself because I remembered that smothering the fire was the safer option. I grabbed the lid of a pot, slid it over the flames, and turned off the burner. It worked, but the whole kitchen was full of smoke, so we evacuated and called the fire department just to be safe. The firefighters said I did the right thing, but they also pointed out how lucky we were that the fire didn't spread further. Lesson learned. Never leave the stove unattended and always keep a fire extinguisher nearby. Story 33. A couple of years ago, I was at an amusement park when I saw a little girl get separated from her parents. She was crying and running around in a panic, and I could see security guards nearby, but no one was doing anything. Instead of grabbing her hand, which can look suspicious, I got down to her level and asked if she knew her parents' phone number. She did, but she was too upset to tell me. I asked her to repeat it slowly and typed it into my phone while waving over a security guard. Within minutes, they tracked down her parents, who were frantic. They hugged her like they'd just won the lottery. Edit. A week later, the amusement park sent me a free ticket as a thank you for helping. I'd never felt like a hero before, but hey, it's not every day you save someone's family vacation. Story 34. One winter, I was driving on a snowy mountain road when my car started sliding toward the edge of a steep drop. I tried hitting the brakes, but it just made things worse. Then I remembered something I'd read about handling skids. Don't brake. Steer into the skid and gently ease off the gas. My instincts were screaming to slam the brakes, but I forced myself to follow the advice. Slowly, the car straightened out, and I managed to stop before going over the edge. I sat there shaking for a few minutes before I could drive again, but at least I made it home in one piece. Now, I always take winter driving courses because one close call was enough for a lifetime. Story 35. When I was younger, I was on a cruise with my family, and we decided to try snorkeling during one of the excursions. Everything was great until I accidentally swam over a patch of coral and felt something sharp slice my leg. The guide immediately told me to get out of the water, and I was freaking out because I'd heard about how dangerous coral cuts can be. Back on the boat, the guide poured vinegar over the wound to clean it, and explained that coral can cause nasty infections if you don't treat it right away. Thankfully, we had a first aid kit on board, and they bandaged me up. Edit. For the rest of the trip, my family joked about how I got into a fight with coral and lost. At least I didn't need stitches, but now I steer clear of reefs. Beautiful, but way too sharp for my taste. Story 36. I once got caught in a thunderstorm while hiking. At first it was just some light rain, but within minutes lightning was striking all around. I remembered hearing that if you're stuck in a storm, you should avoid tall objects and metal, and never lie flat on the ground. Instead, you're supposed to crouch low, balancing on the balls of your feet to minimize contact with the ground. I found a low spot away from trees and rocks, crouched down, and waited it out. The storm passed in about 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When I got back to the parking lot, I saw that a tree near the trailhead had been hit, splitting it in half. I'm just glad I wasn't standing anywhere near it. Story 37. A few years ago, I was at a crowded festival when someone yelled, "He's not breathing!" I ran over to see a man collapsed on the ground. I froze for a second, but then remembered the basics of CPR. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. So, I started chest compressions while someone else called 911. It felt like forever, but after about 2 minutes, the guy coughed and started breathing again. The paramedics arrived soon after and took over. One of them told me later that even a few seconds of hesitation could have made a huge difference in the outcome. Edit. A few weeks later, the man's family reached out to thank me. They even sent me a gift card to a local restaurant, which felt surreal, like I was just in the right place at the right time. Now, I make sure my CPR certification is always up to date. You never know when you'll need it. Story 38. When I was 16, My friend and I thought it'd be fun to explore an old train tunnel near our neighborhood. It was dark and creepy, but we brought flashlights, so we thought we'd be fine. About halfway through, we heard a distant rumble. Yep, a train was coming. We panicked and started running, but the tunnel was too narrow for us to outrun it. Then I spotted a small cutout in the wall, probably meant for workers to step aside when trains passed. We squeezed in just as the train roared past, the air so loud and intense it felt like we'd get sucked out. After it was gone, we stumbled out, shaken but alive. I've never gone near train tracks again, and honestly, I don't need that kind of adrenaline rush ever again. Story 39. One time, I accidentally locked myself out of my apartment with the oven on. I'd been baking cookies, stepped outside to grab a package, and the door slammed shut behind me. My phone was inside, so I couldn't call anyone, and I could already smell the cookies starting to burn. In a panic, I remembered the trick of using a credit card to open a locked door. I grabbed an old library card from my wallet, slid it between the door and the frame, and wiggled it around until the lock popped. I ran inside, pulled the cookies out. They were blackened hockey pucks at that point, and turned off the oven. My apartment smelled like smoke for 2 days, but at least I didn't have to call the fire department. Now, I always double-check before shutting the door, because one baking mishap was enough. Story 40. Last summer, I went swimming at a lake with some friends. We were having a great time until one of my friends dove in and didn't resurface right away. At first, we thought he was joking, but then we saw him flailing just below the surface. Without thinking, I swam over and grabbed him, trying to pull him up. Turns out, he'd cramped up and couldn't move his legs. I remembered that you're supposed to approach a drowning person from behind to avoid getting pulled under. So I swam around him, hooked my arm under his shoulders, and dragged him back to shore. Edit. He spent the rest of the day sitting on the beach, pretending nothing happened. But I kept teasing him about needing swimming lessons. He finally admitted that he didn't drink enough water that day, which probably caused the cramp. Lesson learned. Hydration isn't just for marathon runners. Story 41. A few years ago, I was traveling abroad and decided to try scuba diving for the first time. Everything was fine at first, but as I descended, I started feeling a sharp pain in my ears. I remembered the instructor saying something about equalizing pressure by pinching your nose and blowing gently, but in my panic, I couldn't focus. Instead, I ascended too quickly, which is a huge no-no. By the time I reached the surface, I felt dizzy and nauseous. The dive master immediately got me onto the boat and made me lie down, warning me about decompression sickness. Thankfully, it wasn't severe, but I learned the hard way to follow every instruction carefully when diving. Now, I take extra time to make sure I'm comfortable with all the safety procedures before jumping in. Story 42. One summer, I was grilling in my backyard when I noticed the propane tank had started leaking. I smelled gas and saw a small spark from the grill igniter, and I panicked, thinking the whole thing was about to explode. My first instinct was to grab a bucket of water, but I remembered reading that you should never use water on a gas fire. It only spreads the flames. Instead, I turned off the tank valve with a towel because it was already heating up, moved the grill away, and called the fire department just to be safe. They told me that quick action likely prevented a serious accident. Now, I double-check all my equipment before every barbecue. No burger is worth blowing up the yard. Story 43. A few years ago, I got caught in a rip current while swimming at the beach. I started getting dragged out to sea, and my immediate reaction was to fight it and swim straight back to shore. That's when I remembered the lifeguard's advice. Never fight the current. Swim parallel to the shore until you're out of it, then head back in. It went against every instinct, but I did it. After about 5 minutes, I was out of the current and could swim back safely. The lifeguard later told me that panicking and fighting the current is one of the biggest mistakes swimmers make. Now, I'm the annoying person who tells everyone I meet this tip because it really does save lives. Story 44. I once saw a car accident where one of the vehicles flipped over and caught fire. A man was trapped inside, screaming for help. I ran over with a few others, but the fire was spreading fast, and we couldn't get the door open. One guy yelled for us to grab the car mats and use them to shield our hands while trying to pull the door. It actually worked, and we managed to get the man out just as the flames reached the front seat. The fire department arrived minutes later and said we'd done everything right, but I couldn't stop shaking for hours. Now, I keep gloves in my car just in case something like that ever happens again. Edit. The man we saved later contacted us to say thank you. He said he didn't remember much from the accident, but he did remember someone yelling, "Use the mats!" I guess sometimes the simplest ideas are the most effective. Story 45. When I was in college, I decided to try rock climbing at an indoor gym. I was halfway up a wall when my grip slipped and I fell. The safety harness caught me, but I still hit the wall hard enough to knock the wind out of me. I was fine, but it made me realize how easily accidents can happen, even with safety measures in place. The instructor later explained that I'd made a common mistake, over-gripping the holds and tiring out my hands too quickly. He taught me to relax my grip and rely more on my legs for support. I went back the next week and tried again, and it was a completely different experience. Sometimes, the best way to learn is by falling, literally. Story 46. A few years ago, I decided to take up cycling to get in shape. One afternoon, I was riding on a rural road when a car passed me way too close and clipped my handlebar. I went flying into a ditch, and the driver didn't even stop. My helmet hit a rock, and for a second, I couldn't move. Then I remembered the advice I'd heard a million times. After a fall, stay still and check for injuries before trying to get up. I carefully tested my arms, legs, and neck, relieved that nothing was broken. A passing driver saw me and stopped to help, eventually calling an ambulance just to be safe. The paramedics said the helmet probably saved my life. Now, I never ride without it, and I make sure it's a high-quality one. Story 47. When I was younger, I worked at a summer camp, and one day a camper came running up to me, screaming that there was a snake in the cabin. I rushed over, expecting a harmless garden snake, but no. It was a rattlesnake coiled up under one of the bunks. The first thing I remembered was that you should never try to handle a venomous snake yourself. Instead, I gathered the campers, moved them outside, and called animal control. They arrived quickly and safely removed the snake. Later, they told us it had likely slithered in looking for shade. The kids thought I was a hero, but honestly, I just followed the rules. Lesson learned. Know your limits, especially when it comes to wildlife. Story 48. A couple of years ago, I was walking my dog late at night when I noticed someone following me. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but every time I crossed the street, they did too. My heart was racing, and I remembered hearing that in situations like this, you should head toward well-lit areas or crowded places. I spotted a 24-hour gas station and walked straight in. The person stopped at the edge of the parking lot, then turned and disappeared. The cashier asked if I was okay, and I nodded, but honestly, I was shaking the whole walk home. Now, I always carry a whistle and pepper spray, just in case. Story 49. Last winter, I got snowed in during a road trip. The highway closed, and I ended up stuck in my car overnight with no food or extra blankets. Clearly, I wasn't prepared. I remembered reading that you can stay warm by insulating your body with whatever you have on hand. So, I grabbed the floor mats, wrapped them around my legs, and used my coat as a makeshift sleeping bag. It wasn't comfortable, but it kept me warm enough to get through the night. The next morning, the plows cleared the road, and I managed to get to a gas station for supplies. Now, I always keep an emergency kit in my car, complete with blankets, snacks, and a flashlight. Lesson learned the hard way. Story 50. A few months ago, I was at the park with my niece when she decided to climb the tallest jungle gym she could find. She got to the top, then froze, too scared to climb back down. I climbed up to help her, but then realized we were both stuck. I started panicking until I remembered something I'd read. When helping someone who's scared, you should focus on calming them down first before trying to move. I started talking to her about her favorite cartoons, slowly getting her to stop crying. Then, step by step, we climbed down together. Edit. Later, she told her mom that I was her superhero. Meanwhile, I was just glad I didn't break my ankle trying to keep up with a 6-year-old. Moral of the story: sometimes being calm is the best rescue tool. Story 51. A few years ago, I was at a family barbecue when my cousin started choking on a piece of steak. At first, we all froze, unsure of what to do. But then I remembered the Heimlich maneuver. I got behind him and started abdominal thrusts, hoping I was doing it right. On the third thrust, the steak shot out like a cork, and he gasped for air. Everyone cheered like I'd just won an Olympic medal, but honestly, I was shaking for the rest of the day. It made me realize how important it is to know basic first aid. After that, I made a point to get certified in CPR and first aid because you never know when you'll need it. Story 52. One summer, I was on a boat with some friends when we decided to go swimming. I jumped in first, and everything was fine until I realized I'd drifted too far from the boat. The current was pulling me farther out, and no matter how hard I swam, I couldn't get closer. Then I remembered a tip from a lifeguard. Instead of fighting the current, swim diagonally toward the shore or a stationary object. It takes longer, but it works. I started swimming at an angle, and eventually I got back to the boat. My friends hadn't even noticed anything was wrong. I played it off like nothing happened, but inside I was rattled. Lesson learned: never underestimate the power of water currents. Story 53. Last year, I was driving through the mountains when my brakes started acting up. The pedal felt soft, and I realized I was losing brake fluid. To make it worse, I was heading downhill with sharp curves ahead. I panicked, but remembered a tip I'd heard. Use the emergency brake and downshift to a lower gear to slow the car. I gently pulled the emergency brake and shifted into second gear, letting the engine do most of the work. It wasn't a smooth ride, but it got me to a safe spot where I could stop and call for a tow. The mechanic later told me the brakes were seconds away from completely failing. Now, I always get my car checked before long trips, because I'd rather avoid another mountain meltdown. Story 54. A few years ago, I got stuck in an elevator during a power outage. There were about 6 of us inside, and at first, everyone was calm. But then someone started panicking, claiming we'd run out of air. I remembered hearing that elevators aren't airtight, and that staying calm conserves oxygen. I explained this to the group and suggested we sit down to avoid overheating. It took about an hour for maintenance to get us out, but staying calm made all the difference. Later, one of the other passengers thanked me for keeping everyone level-headed. Now, I'm the person who awkwardly smiles at strangers in elevators, hoping to avoid another emergency. Story 55. One time, I was babysitting my neighbor's kids when the younger one accidentally locked himself in the bathroom. He started screaming, and I could hear him banging on the door, but I couldn't open it because the lock was jammed. I remembered seeing a trick online about using a credit card to unlock doors. I grabbed my library card, slid it between the door and the frame, and managed to pop the lock open. The kid came running out, crying and holding a stuffed dinosaur. I spent the next hour convincing him the bathroom wasn't out to get him. Edit. The neighbors gave me a gift card as a thank you, but the real win was that the kid started calling me his hero, which I think is the most adorable title I've ever earned. Lesson learned: always stay calm and improvise when things go sideways. Story 56. A couple of years ago, I was out camping in the desert when I got caught in a sudden sandstorm. One moment, the sky was clear, and the next, I was surrounded by howling wind and flying sand. I remembered reading that during a sandstorm, you should cover your nose and mouth with a cloth to avoid breathing in sand and find shelter immediately. I crouched behind a large rock, wrapping my shirt over my face, and stayed low until the storm passed. It lasted about 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. By the time it was over, my tent was half buried in sand, but at least I avoided any serious injuries. Now, I always check the weather forecast before heading into the desert. Lesson learned. Story 57. One winter, I was walking home from a friend's house when I slipped on black ice and hit my knee hard. I couldn't get back up because every time I tried to stand, I'd just slip again. That's when I remembered a trick I'd seen online. You're supposed to crawl on all fours to distribute your weight evenly. So there I was, crawling down the sidewalk like a confused bear. But it worked. I got to a patch of snow and was able to stand up. My knee was bruised for days, but at least I didn't break anything. Now, I wear shoes with better grip in the winter and try not to laugh when I see someone else using the bear crawl trick. Story 58. One summer, I decided to go kayaking with a friend on a calm lake. Everything was great until we hit a section with a surprising current that pushed us toward some low-hanging branches. My friend panicked and started paddling backward, which just made things worse. I remembered the tip I'd learned during a safety briefing. If you're heading toward an obstacle, lean into it instead of away. It sounds counterintuitive, but it keeps you from tipping over. I yelled at my friend to lean toward the branch and steer to the side, and we managed to avoid flipping the kayak. Afterward, she swore off kayaking forever, but I was just relieved we didn't end up swimming with the fish. Story 59. A few years ago, I was home alone when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to break in. My heart was racing, but instead of panicking, I remembered some advice. Make as much noise as possible to scare them off. I grabbed a pot and a metal spoon, ran to the back door, and started banging like my life depended on it. I even yelled something ridiculous like, "I've got a big dog!" I didn't. After a few seconds, I heard footsteps running away. I called the police, and they said my quick thinking probably prevented the intruder from coming inside. Now, I keep actual safety measures in place, like a security system, so I don't have to rely on my questionable cooking skills to save the day again. Story 60. One time, I was babysitting a neighbor's toddler when she suddenly started coughing and couldn't stop. At first, I thought she was just choking on a snack, but then she turned red and couldn't catch her breath. I panicked, but remembered something I'd seen in a first aid video. For toddlers, you're supposed to give back blows while keeping their head lower than their chest. I sat her on my lap, leaned her forward, and gave a few firm pats between her shoulder blades. On the second one, a small plastic bead popped out of her mouth. Edit. When her mom got home and heard the story, she hugged me like I'd saved her entire world. I started keeping a mental checklist of everything small enough for a toddler to swallow after that. Better safe than sorry. Story 61. A few years ago, I was hiking in a remote forest when I got separated from my group. I didn't panic at first, thinking I'd catch up. But after an hour of wandering, I realized I was completely lost. I remembered reading that in these situations, you should stay put to make it easier for rescuers to find you. I found a clearing, built a small fire, and used my emergency whistle to signal every 15 minutes. By the time night fell, I was starting to get worried. But then I heard distant voices calling my name. It turned out the fire's smoke and my whistle had helped the search party locate me. They told me later that staying put probably saved me from spending the night out there. Now, I never go hiking without a map, a whistle, and a plan. Story 62. One summer, I was on a road trip with some friends when we ran out of gas in the middle of nowhere. It was over 100 degrees and we had no cell service. I remembered hearing that in extreme heat, staying in your car is safer than walking for help. It keeps you shaded and reduces dehydration. So, we stayed put, drank the little water we had sparingly, and waited for another car to pass. It took 3 hours, but eventually, a kind stranger stopped and helped us get to a gas station. The experience was miserable, but it taught me to always carry extra water and a gas can on long trips. Lesson learned. The desert doesn't care about your poor planning. Story 63. One winter evening, I was walking my dog when I noticed a house with smoke pouring out of the windows. I ran up and pounded on the door, but no one answered. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but before I could, the door opened and a confused-looking man stepped out. I yelled, "Your house is on fire!" He turned and saw the smoke, then ran back inside to grab his dog. I stopped him, remembering that going back into a burning building is one of the worst things you can do. Instead, I told him to wait for the firefighters, who arrived a few minutes later. The man and his dog were safe, and the firefighters managed to contain the fire. Now, I make sure my own smoke alarms are in working order, because that situation could happen to anyone. Story 64. A few years ago, I was swimming in the ocean when I accidentally got caught in a rip current. It was terrifying. No matter how hard I swam, I kept getting pulled farther out. My arms were getting tired, and I started to panic. Then I remembered what a lifeguard had told me years ago. Swim parallel to the shore, not straight back. I shifted direction, and after what felt like forever, I finally broke free of the current. By the time I reached the shore, I was exhausted, but incredibly relieved. Now, whenever I go to the beach, I always check for rip currents before getting in the water. Story 65. When I was a kid, I went camping with my family, and one night, we heard a bear rummaging through our campsite. My dad immediately grabbed a flashlight and started yelling at the bear to scare it off, but it didn't budge. I remembered hearing that bears hate high-pitched noises, so I grabbed my little whistle and started blowing it like crazy. The bear froze, looked around, and then lumbered off into the woods. Edit. My dad later told me he thought the bear left because of his intimidating yelling, but we all know it was the whistle. I still bring that same whistle every time I go camping, just in case my dad's ego isn't enough to scare off wildlife. Story 66. A couple of years ago, I was traveling abroad when I got stuck in a packed subway car. Everything was fine until the train stopped unexpectedly in the middle of a tunnel and the lights went out. People around me started panicking, and it got harder to breathe as everyone crowded closer. I remembered reading that in emergencies, staying calm and keeping your breathing steady can help prevent full-blown panic attacks. So, I focused on taking deep, slow breaths and reassured the people near me that it was probably just a minor delay. After about 15 minutes, the power came back and we started moving again. A woman next to me thanked me for keeping her calm, but honestly, I was just relieved we weren't stuck there all night. Story 67. One time, I was at a pool party when a kid started struggling in the deep end. Everyone froze, unsure of what to do, so I jumped in without thinking. I reached him quickly, but he panicked and started climbing on me, nearly pulling me under. I remembered a tip from a lifeguard training video. Approach a struggling swimmer from behind to avoid being overwhelmed. I swam around him, hooked my arm under his shoulders, and got him safely to the edge. He was coughing, but fine. The parents thanked me profusely, and I left feeling like I'd just passed a real-life test. Now, I always make sure there's a lifeguard, or at least a responsible adult nearby, before jumping into situations like that again. Story 68. I once got locked out of my car in the middle of a snowstorm. My phone was inside, and the nearest building was about a quarter-mile away. I thought about walking for help, but the wind was brutal, and I knew I'd risk frostbite. Then I remembered a trick I'd seen online. Take off your shoelaces, tie them together, and use them to create a loop to slip through the door crack and pull the lock. It took some trial and error, but I managed to pop the lock open just as my fingers were starting to go numb. I sat in the car with the heat blasting, thanking past me for watching all those random life hack videos. Story 69. A few summers ago, I went paddleboarding for the first time. About 30 minutes in, the wind picked up, and I started drifting farther from the shore. I paddled as hard as I could, but the wind was too strong, and I started to panic. I remembered reading that in situations like this, you should lie flat on the board to reduce resistance and paddle with your arms instead of standing up. It felt ridiculous, but it worked. I slowly made my way back to shore. When I got back, a lifeguard told me the wind conditions were too dangerous for paddleboarding that day. Lesson learned. Always check the weather before trying a new activity. Story 70. Last year, I was at a wedding when one of the older guests collapsed during the reception. Everyone froze, unsure of what to do. But I remembered my CPR training and rushed over. I checked for a pulse. There wasn't one. So I started chest compressions while someone called 911. It felt like forever, but after a couple of minutes, the man coughed and started breathing again. The paramedics arrived shortly after and took over. Edit. A few days later, the man's family reached out to thank me and said he was doing fine. The bride joked that I'd saved the party. But honestly, I was just glad I remembered my training. Now, I make sure to keep my CPR certification up to date because you never know when you'll need it. Story 71. A few years ago, I went on a cross-country road trip with a friend. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, our car broke down. The engine wouldn't start, and there was no cell service. My friend wanted to start walking to find help, but I remembered the survival tip. Never leave your car in these situations. It's easier for rescuers to spot a vehicle than a person. We decided to wait, flashing the car's hazard lights periodically to conserve battery. Hours later, a truck driver spotted us and gave us a ride to the nearest town. The mechanic later said it was a simple issue with the alternator, but I still think staying put saved us a lot of trouble. Lesson learned. Always have a plan for the middle of nowhere. Story 72. When I was in high school, I worked part-time at a coffee shop. One day, a customer came in, looking pale and shaky. He suddenly collapsed, and I realized he wasn't breathing. I froze for a second, but then my training kicked in. I yelled for someone to call 911 and started chest compressions. After what felt like forever, the paramedics arrived and took over. They said my quick actions likely saved his life. Edit. The man came back a few weeks later to thank me personally, bringing a card and a box of chocolates. It was surreal to hear him say I'd given him a second chance. That day, I realized how important even basic CPR training can be. Story 73. One summer, I went whitewater rafting with a group of friends. We were having a great time until our raft hit a rock and flipped. Everyone got tossed into the rapids. The current was strong, and I could feel myself being pulled under. I remembered what the guide had told us earlier. Lie on your back, keep your feet pointing downstream, and use your arms to steer toward the shore. It was terrifying, but I did exactly that and managed to reach a calm area where I could swim to safety. The guides eventually rounded up everyone else, but the experience shook all of us. Now, I make sure to listen carefully to safety briefings. Those tips are there for a reason. Story 74. A few years ago, I was at a restaurant when I noticed a man at the next table clutching his throat. He was turning red, clearly choking. His family was panicking, but no one seemed to know what to do. I rushed over, got behind him, and performed the Heimlich maneuver. On the third thrust, a piece of steak flew out of his mouth, and he started breathing again. His wife hugged me, and the man kept saying, "Thank you." It was the first time I'd ever had to use the Heimlich in real life, and it made me realize how important it is to know these things. Story 75. During a camping trip last year, I decided to explore a nearby stream alone. It was peaceful until I lost my footing and slipped into the water. The current wasn't fast, but the rocks were slippery, and I couldn't get a good grip to pull myself out. Then I remembered a trick I'd read about. Instead of fighting the current, let it carry you to a calmer spot. I let myself float for a few minutes until I reached an area with fewer rocks and managed to climb out. I was soaked and embarrassed, but otherwise fine. My friends teased me about my adventure, but I'm just glad I remembered that tip in the moment. Story 76. A few years ago, I was on a late-night train heading home after work. The car was mostly empty except for a guy sitting a few rows away who kept staring at me. I felt uneasy, so I moved to another seat, but he followed. That's when I remembered a safety tip. If you think someone is following you in a public space, look for someone official or move toward a group of people. I walked to the front of the train where the conductor was. The guy stopped following and got off at the next station. The conductor asked if I was okay and even offered to walk me to my car when we arrived at my stop. Now, I always make sure to stay near other people or authority figures in situations like that. Story 77. Last summer, I went on a weekend camping trip with some friends. On the second night, we ran out of firewood and decided to go searching for more. I wandered a bit too far from the campsite and lost my way. It was pitch dark, and my phone's flashlight was dying. I remembered reading that if you're lost, follow the sound of water. It often leads to civilization. I found a stream and walked along it until I saw a faint light in the distance. It turned out to be our campsite. My friends were about to start searching for me, but thankfully I made it back. Lesson learned. Always bring a fully charged flashlight and stay within shouting distance of your group. Story 78. I once witnessed a car accident where a driver hit a pole and their car caught fire. The driver was trapped inside and screaming for help. A few of us ran over, but the door was jammed. Someone suggested using a rock to break the window, but I remembered a better trick. Hit the corner of the glass instead of the center, because it's weaker there. It worked, and we managed to pull the driver out just before the fire spread. The paramedics arrived shortly after, and said our quick actions likely saved the person's life. I've since added a small window-breaking tool to my car emergency kit, just in case. Story 79. When I was a kid, I got lost at a crowded amusement park. I was terrified and couldn't find my parents anywhere. Instead of running around aimlessly, I went to the nearest staff member and told them I was lost. They took me to the park's lost and found station, where they announced my name over the loudspeakers. My parents showed up within minutes, equally panicked but relieved to find me. Now, whenever I go anywhere with kids, I teach them to look for someone in a uniform if they get separated. It's such a simple tip, but it can make all the difference in a scary situation. Story 80. A few months ago, I was babysitting for a friend when their toddler started choking on a piece of fruit. She couldn't breathe and was turning red. I panicked for a second, but then remembered the first aid steps for young children. I picked her up, flipped her over so her head was lower than her chest, and gave 5 back blows between her shoulder blades. On the third hit, the piece of fruit popped out, and she started crying, which was the best sound I've ever heard. Edit. When her parents came home, I told them what happened. They immediately replaced all the hard fruit in the house with softer snacks. They also signed up for a first aid course, which I think is the smartest thing they could have done. Now, I'm the overly cautious babysitter who cuts everything into tiny pieces. Better safe than sorry. Story 81. I once had a coworker who claimed they could fall asleep anywhere, anytime in less than a minute. Naturally, we didn't believe them. So, one day during lunch, they casually leaned back in their chair, crossed their arms, and boom, out like a light. At first we laughed, but then something wild happened. A fire alarm test went off, loud and obnoxious, and this person didn't even flinch. While the rest of us bolted out of the building, they were still there, peacefully snoozing like nothing happened. When they woke up, their only comment was, "Did I miss something?" Turns out, they trained themselves to sleep through anything because they used to live next to an airport. I don't know what was crazier, their talent for napping or the fact that I now can't unhear their snoring every time I see a plane. Story 82. A few years ago, I accidentally discovered that you can unlock a car door with a shoelace. It started when I locked my keys in the car at a gas station, miles from home, with no spare key. A random guy saw me panicking and said, "Give me your shoelace." I thought he was joking, but nope. He tied a loop, fished it through the top of the car door, and popped the lock open in about 15 seconds. I was so grateful I didn't even stop to think about the implications of this until later. Like, how many cars could this guy unlock in a day? I tried it on my car again later, just to see if I could do it myself, and it worked. Now I keep a pair of extra laces in my glove box, just in case. Is it weird that I also low-key fear my own car now? Story 83. When I was 10, my older brother told me that if I ever got attacked by a shark, I should punch it in the nose. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and for years I assumed everyone knew this. Fast forward to last summer. I'm at the beach with friends, and someone spots a shark in the water. Everyone freaks out and scrambles to shore, but guess who's out there yelling, "Punch it in the nose!" Yeah, me. The lifeguard heard me and gave me a look like I'd lost my mind. Later, I googled it and found out the whole punch the shark thing is kind of true, but it's more of a last resort move. Also, they recommend targeting the gills or eyes instead. So, thanks bro, for almost turning me into shark bait. Story 84. My grandma once told me to always carry a paper map, even in the age of GPS. I used to laugh at her advice, like, come on, who even sells maps anymore? But then, one time on a road trip, my phone died and the car charger broke, leaving me completely lost in the middle of nowhere. Guess who had the last laugh? Yep, Grandma. I pulled out the map she'd stuffed into my glove box years ago, just in case, and managed to find my way to a gas station. Moral of the story: old school navigation might save your life, or at least save you from spending the night in a ditch. Edit. Forgot to mention, if you don't know how to read a map, this tip might not help you. Good luck out there. Story 85. I read somewhere that you should never run in a zigzag if you're being chased by an alligator. Naturally, I assumed it was some survival expert's pro tip, but then I ended up Googling it one night. Don't ask why. Turns out, alligators are fast but terrible at sharp turns, so the zigzag thing might actually work. But here's the catch. Experts say your best bet is to avoid getting chased by an alligator in the first place. Like, don't hang out near the water at dusk or dangle your feet off the dock. Apparently, alligators have this thing called a burst of speed, which sounds terrifyingly efficient for something that looks like a prehistoric loaf of bread. So now I live my life with two rules. Don't trust random internet tips, and don't go anywhere near places where alligators might exist. Seems like a solid strategy. Story 86. A couple of years ago, I got trapped in an elevator for 2 hours. At first I thought, cool, this is my movie moment. Someone will rescue me in 10 minutes max. But after 30 minutes, the claustrophobia started creeping in. I remembered reading somewhere that you should conserve air by breathing slowly, so I started doing exaggerated yoga breaths to stay calm. The worst part? I wasn't alone. I was trapped with a guy who wouldn't stop panicking. This guy kept hitting all the buttons, yelling for help, and at one point tried prying the doors open with his bare hands. I told him to sit down and conserve his energy, but he just shot me a look like I'd suggested we wait for aliens to rescue us. Finally, after what felt like forever, the doors opened and we were free. The guy bolted without even a "thanks for keeping your cool." Later, I learned you're supposed to just press the emergency button and wait. But hey, the yoga breaths worked. I might start carrying snacks just in case next time, though. Story 87. One summer, I decided to go camping by myself because apparently I thought I was Bear Grylls. I made it one night before everything went sideways. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something rustling outside my tent. Naturally, my brain went straight to wild animal, so I grabbed my flashlight and a pocket knife, because sure, that would definitely save me from a bear. Turns out it wasn't a bear. It was a raccoon, and this little guy had unzipped my backpack. Seriously, how do they know how to do that? And was happily munching on my granola bars. When I tried to scare it off, it just hissed at me like it owned the place. The worst part? It took my last granola bar and ran. I packed up and left at dawn because I figured if the raccoons were that bold, I didn't want to stick around to see what else was lurking in the woods. Lesson learned. Always hang your food from a tree, and maybe stick to car camping. Story 88. I used to work at a zoo, and one of the first things they teach you is how to stay safe around the animals. One day, a visitor asked what to do if you're ever face to face with a lion in the wild. Before I could answer, my coworker jumped in and said, "Just make eye contact and back away slowly." The visitor nodded like that made total sense, but I knew it was garbage advice. Later, I looked it up, and guess what? Lions see direct eye contact as a challenge. So, if you ever find yourself near one, you're supposed to avoid eye contact and stay calm. Basically, act like you're the least interesting meal they've ever seen. I still think about that visitor and hope they never actually needed lion survival tips. Maybe we should have just told them to stay far away from lions altogether. Story 89. One time, my phone's flashlight saved me from a very sketchy situation. I was walking home late at night, and I noticed someone following me. I tried to shake them by crossing the street, but they crossed right after me. My heart was racing, and I remembered a safety tip I'd read online. Always make it look like you're not an easy target. So I whipped out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and held it out like a weapon. I even yelled, "Who's there?" like I had backup waiting around the corner. To my surprise, the person stopped in their tracks and turned around. I walked the rest of the way home shaking like a leaf, but at least I was safe. Now I always keep my phone fully charged when I'm out late, and maybe I should invest in a real flashlight that doesn't also drain my battery. Edit. A few people asked what to do if your phone's dead. My advice? Just scream loudly and run toward the nearest well-lit area. Also, consider carrying pepper spray. Story 90. I once got stung by a jellyfish while swimming at the beach. Let me tell you, the pain was no joke. I scrambled to the lifeguard stand, clutching my arm like it was falling off. The lifeguard calmly asked if I'd heard of the pee trick. I thought they were kidding, but nope. They said some people believe urine neutralizes the sting. I was not about to test that theory, so they gave me vinegar instead, which actually helped. Later, I found out the whole pee thing is a myth. Apparently, it can even make the sting worse. So now, I tell everyone, if you get stung by a jellyfish, stick to vinegar or hot water. Also, maybe just don't swim where jellyfish hang out. Beaches are nice and all, but so is not feeling like you're being electrocuted by sea creatures. Story 91. I'll never forget the time I tried to save a turtle crossing the road. It was one of those tiny, adorable ones, and I figured, hey, good deed of the day, right? So, I pulled over, ran to grab it, and big mistake, I picked it up the wrong way. Turns out, turtles have this charming defense mechanism where they, release themselves. Let's just say I got an unexpected shower that ruined my favorite sneakers. To make matters worse, as I was carrying the turtle to the side of the road, it started scratching at me like it was personally offended by my rescue attempt. I finally set it down near a pond, and it just stared at me like, "That's it? You're done?" Lesson learned. If you're going to help a turtle, pick it up from the sides and never underestimate its ability to make a mess. Also, maybe bring gloves. Story 92. One time during a thunderstorm, my mom freaked out because I was on my phone. She told me lightning could strike if I kept using it, and I laughed, thinking it was just one of those old-school myths. But curiosity got the better of me, so I looked it up. Turns out, she wasn't entirely wrong. While your phone itself isn't a lightning magnet, being outside with metal objects or electronics can increase your risk. The lightning doesn't care about your TikTok scrolling. It's just looking for a path to the ground. And guess what? That path might just be you. Now I avoid using my phone during storms, not because I'm scared of the phone part, but because the idea of being electrocuted mid-selfie isn't exactly how I want to go. Mom still reminds me of this every time it rains, and honestly, I let her. She's earned it. Story 93. A few months ago, I tried urban biking for the first time, thinking it would be a fun, eco-friendly way to get around. What I didn't anticipate was the absolute chaos of city streets. At one point, a car door swung open in front of me, and I barely swerved in time. Then, a pigeon dive-bombed me like it had a personal vendetta. The real kicker was when I hit a pothole, lost control, and ended up sprawled on the pavement. A stranger ran over to help and said, "First time biking, huh?" I nodded, trying to laugh off the fact that I'd just humiliated myself in front of half the city. Since then, I've learned a few things. Always check for car doors, wear a helmet, and avoid eye contact with pigeons. They're plotting something, I swear. Story 94. I once got locked out of my house while taking the trash out. The worst part? I was in my pajamas, bright yellow with little ducks on them, and it was the middle of the day. I tried every window, but they were all locked. My phone was inside, so calling for help wasn't an option. That's when I remembered an old trick, using a credit card to jimmy the lock. It sounds like something out of a movie, but desperate times call for desperate measures. After about 10 minutes of trying, I finally got the door open. I was so relieved I didn't even care that the neighbors had been watching the whole time, probably wondering if I was breaking into my own house. Edit. For anyone asking, no, this doesn't work on modern locks. If you're going to try this, make sure your card isn't important. I destroyed an old gift card in the process. Story 95. Back in college, my friends and I went on a spontaneous hike without checking the weather. Classic mistake. Halfway up the trail, it started pouring rain, and the dirt path turned into a slip and slide. To make matters worse, none of us had packed rain gear. We found a small overhang to take cover, but it wasn't enough. By the time the rain stopped, we were soaked and freezing. On the way down, one of my friends slipped, landed in a puddle, and just stayed there like, "This is my life now." The kicker? When we got back to the parking lot, the sun came out like nothing had happened. Now I always pack a poncho and extra socks, even if the weather app says clear skies. It's not paranoia, it's survival. Story 96. One time I was dog sitting for a friend, and their dog, an adorable but mischievous golden retriever, managed to eat an entire loaf of bread while I was in the shower. I freaked out, Googled if bread could be harmful to dogs, and learned two things. First, most bread isn't toxic to dogs, but it can expand in their stomachs and cause problems. Second, I had just signed up for an all-night monitoring session. The dog seemed totally fine, wagging his tail and looking at me like I was overreacting. But I was paranoid, so I ended up sleeping on the couch next to him, waking up every hour to make sure he wasn't bloating or acting weird. The next morning, he was perfectly fine. Meanwhile, I looked like I'd been through a war. When my friend came back, they casually said, "Oh yeah, he does that all the time. He loves bread." I've never felt so betrayed in my life. Story 97. A few years ago, I tried to impress a date by making dinner from scratch. I went all out. Fancy pasta, homemade sauce, the works. But while draining the pasta, I accidentally dumped the entire pot, noodles and all, into the sink. I froze, staring at my ruined masterpiece, while my date tried to reassure me with, "It's fine, we can just order pizza." Determined not to give up, I scooped the pasta out, rinsed it like my life depended on it, and served it anyway. The date went along with it, but I could tell they weren't convinced. Later, I confessed what happened, and we both burst out laughing. We didn't end up together, but now I always use a colander like a normal person. Lesson learned. Sometimes it's better to stick to takeout. Story 98. When I was a kid, my dad taught me how to swim by literally throwing me into the deep end of a pool. He said it was character building, but all I remember is flailing around like I was auditioning for a disaster movie. Eventually, I figured out how to dog paddle, and my dad stood at the edge, clapping like he'd just witnessed the Olympics. Looking back, it was probably a questionable parenting move, but it worked. I learned to swim that day and never forgot it. Now, every time I see kids in swimming lessons with floaties and patient instructors, I wonder if my dad just didn't want to pay for lessons. Either way, I guess I owe him for the life skill, even if I earned it through sheer panic. Story 99. A few months ago, I decided to try axe throwing for the first time. The instructor gave us a quick safety briefing, but let's be real, I was only half listening because I was too busy imagining myself as some medieval warrior. When it was my turn, I chucked the axe with all my strength, and it ricocheted off the target and flew back toward me. Luckily, it didn't hit anyone, but the entire room went silent. The instructor calmly walked over, picked up the axe, and said, "Maybe a little less power next time." I was so embarrassed I wanted to crawl into a hole, but I gave it another shot, this time with slightly less enthusiasm, and actually managed to hit the target. Edit. For those asking, yes, they made me sign a waiver beforehand. And no, I haven't been back since. Story 100. Once I accidentally boarded the wrong train during a trip to New York City. I didn't realize my mistake until the train started moving, and the announcements didn't match the destination I was expecting. Panicked, I asked the guy next to me what stop this train was headed to, and he just said, "Not where you're going." I ended up getting off at some random station in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and only $5 cash. A kind station worker eventually helped me figure out the right train, but I had to wait 2 hours for it to arrive. In the meantime, I ate the saddest vending machine snack and reflected on my poor life choices. Now, I double-check every ticket, every sign, and every announcement. Paranoia? Maybe, but at least I know where I'm going. Story 101. A few years back, I joined the community 5K run because I thought it would be fun. Spoiler, it wasn't. I trained for about a week thinking, how hard can running 3 miles be? Well, let me tell you. When race day came, it was harder than trying to assemble IKEA furniture without the instructions. About halfway through, I started questioning all my life choices. My legs felt like jelly, I was wheezing like an old accordion, and an 80-year-old man zoomed past me like it was his morning stroll. By the last stretch, I was barely moving, but the crowd at the finish line started cheering. For a brief, glorious moment, I thought it was for me. Nope, it was for a woman behind me who was pushing a stroller and running faster than I was. I did eventually finish, though, and rewarded myself with enough carbs to undo any benefit of the run. Moral of the story? Running is hard, but the post-race snacks make it worth it. Story 102. One time, I accidentally locked myself out of my car, with the engine still running. To make matters worse, it was in the middle of summer, and the gas station attendant just stood there watching me panic. I tried everything, jiggling the handle, checking if any windows were cracked open, even attempting the old coat hanger trick with a random piece of wire I found. After about 20 minutes, a kind stranger walked by and asked if I needed help. I nodded like my life depended on it, and they pulled out a Slim Jim, a tool for unlocking car doors, not the snack. Within seconds, they had my door open. I was so grateful I offered to buy them a drink, but they just waved me off and said, "Pay it forward." Now, I keep a spare key in one of those magnetic hide-a-key boxes under my car, and I double-check every time before closing the door. Lesson learned. Always be prepared for your own stupidity. Story 103. When I was in college, I got roped into going to a haunted house with some friends. I've never been a fan of jump scares, but I figured I could handle it. Big mistake. The first room was fine, just a few creepy decorations and fake cobwebs. But then we got to the part with the chainsaw guy. As soon as I heard the roar of the chainsaw, I bolted, leaving my friends behind. I ran so fast I accidentally crashed into one of the actors, who broke character to ask if I was okay. Meanwhile, my friends were dying of laughter, and I was trying to convince myself I hadn't just had a minor heart attack. To this day, I refuse to set foot in a haunted house. My friends still tease me about it, but I don't care. Survival instincts kicked in, and honestly, I regret nothing. Story 104. I once tried to make homemade sushi because I thought it would be cheaper and healthier than going out. It started fine. I had the rice, the seaweed, and a bunch of fresh veggies. But the second I tried to roll it, everything fell apart. Literally. It was like trying to fold a wet paper towel around marbles. I ended up with a pile of rice, torn seaweed, and lopsided vegetables that looked more like a failed art project than food. To salvage the situation, I called it deconstructed sushi and ate it with a spoon. It tasted fine, but the effort was definitely not worth the 3 hours I spent cleaning up rice from every surface in my kitchen. Now, I just order sushi and pretend I never tried. Sometimes, you have to accept that restaurants exist for a reason. Edit. For everyone asking, no, I didn't use a bamboo mat. Maybe that's where I went wrong. Or maybe I just lack the patience required for sushi making. Either way, lesson learned. Story 105. A couple of years ago, I went kayaking with a group of friends. It was supposed to be a peaceful day on the water, but nature had other plans. About an hour in, I noticed dark clouds rolling in, and within minutes, we were caught in a downpour. At first, it was kind of fun, like a scene from an adventure movie. But then the wind picked up, and my kayak started drifting toward some rocks. I paddled as hard as I could, but the current was too strong. One of my friends had to tow me back to safety with a rope they just happened to have in their kayak. When we finally made it to shore, we were all drenched and exhausted, but we couldn't stop laughing at how unprepared we were. Now I always check the weather before kayaking, and I keep an emergency rope with me. It's not paranoia. It's just being smarter than past me. Story 106. A few years ago, I thought it would be a great idea to try bouldering at an indoor rock climbing gym. I'd seen people do it online and thought, how hard could it be? Well, let me tell you, it's way harder than it looks. About 5 minutes in, I was already out of breath. My hands felt like they'd been sandpapered, and I was clinging to the wall like a cat stuck on a screen door. The highlight, though, was when I got halfway up a route, looked down, and realized I had no idea how to get back down. A kid, maybe 10 years old, casually climbed past me and said, "You just jump!" before landing gracefully on the padded floor. Meanwhile, I was frozen in terror, considering my life choices. Eventually, I did jump, but not before the entire gym had witnessed my existential crisis. Now, whenever someone suggests rock climbing, I just smile and say, I'm more of a hiking person. Story 107. One time, I accidentally microwaved a bowl of instant ramen without adding water. It was late, I was tired, and my brain clearly wasn't functioning. About a minute in, I noticed a burning smell, and when I opened the microwave, there was a mini fire inside. The noodles had turned into this blackened, smoldering brick of sadness. I panicked, grabbed the bowl, and ran to the sink, only to realize I'd melted part of the plastic. My roommate walked in just as I was trying to air out the kitchen and said, "What died in here?" To this day, I'm not allowed to make ramen without supervision. Edit. For everyone asking, no, the microwave didn't survive. We had to replace it, and my roommate made me split the cost. Lesson learned. Always check the instructions, even for the simplest things. Story 108. Last summer, I decided to teach myself how to skateboard. It seemed like a cool way to get around, and I figured I'd pick it up quickly. I mean, I already knew how to ride a bike, so how different could it be? Turns out, it's very different. On my first attempt, I stepped on the board, wobbled for about 2 seconds, and immediately ate pavement. My neighbors, who were watering their garden, watched the whole thing and politely pretended not to laugh. I, on the other hand, was laughing to hide my humiliation. Over the next week, I kept practicing, and while I did get better, I also accumulated more bruises than I thought was physically possible. By the end of the summer, I could ride in a straight line, but I retired the board shortly after. Now, every time I see a skater, I silently applaud their balance skills. Story 109. One time, I volunteered at a charity car wash with some friends, thinking it would be an easy way to help out. Everything was going great until we got to this one car, a brand new black SUV. As I was drying it off, I accidentally knocked over the bucket of soapy water onto the hood. I froze, panicking, while the owner just stood there watching. My friend rushed over to help, and together, we managed to clean up the mess without leaving any scratches. The owner laughed it off and said, "At least it's clean now." But I could tell they weren't thrilled. After that, I stuck to holding signs by the road. Turns out, washing cars is more stressful than it looks. Next time, I think I'll just donate money and call it a day. Story 110. I'll never forget the time I tried to make popcorn on the stove instead of using a microwave. It was one of those back-to-basics moments where I thought, this will taste so much better. Well, it didn't. I followed the instructions on the bag, or so I thought, but halfway through I realized the oil was too hot. The kernels started exploding like firecrackers, and I couldn't get the lid on fast enough. Popcorn was flying everywhere. The floor, the counter, even the sink. When it finally stopped, my kitchen looked like a movie theater had exploded. And the popcorn? Half burnt, half uncooked. I ended up ordering pizza instead. Now, every time I see those stovetop popcorn kits at the store, I just walk right past them. Some things are better left to the professionals or the microwave. Story 111. A few years ago, I was house-sitting for a friend who had the fanciest smart home setup I'd ever seen. Everything was controlled by voice commands, the lights, the thermostat, even the blinds. On my first night there, I decided to try it out and said, "Turn off the lights." Nothing happened. I tried again, louder this time. "Turn off the lights." Still nothing. Frustrated, I went to the app on my phone, only to realize I didn't have the password to access it. So, I spent the night manually unplugging lamps and covering the blinking smart devices with random towels I found around the house. When my friend got back, I told them about my struggle, and they laughed so hard they cried. Turns out, I'd been using the wrong wake word the whole time. It was set to respond to Jarvis, not Alexa. Never again will I trust technology to be smarter than me. Story 112. One time, I decided to cook a fancy dinner for my parents to prove that I wasn't completely useless in the kitchen. The main dish? Beef Wellington. Yes, I aimed high. I followed the recipe video step by step, feeling like a contestant on a cooking show. Everything was going fine until I got to the puff pastry. Apparently, you're supposed to roll it out quickly to keep it cold, but I spent so much time fussing over it that it turned into a sticky, doughy mess. When I finally got the Wellington in the oven, it looked more like a lumpy burrito than a gourmet dish. My parents were kind enough to eat it anyway, but the look on their faces said it all. Later, my mom told me, "You know, lasagna would have been just as impressive." Lesson learned. Start small before attempting anything Gordon Ramsay level. Story 113. A couple of years ago, I was hiking in the mountains when I came across a sign that said, "Beware of bears." I laughed it off, thinking, what are the chances? About an hour later, I heard a rustling in the bushes and froze. My brain immediately went to bear mode. Remembering advice I'd read, I started talking loudly to make myself seem big and uninteresting. "Hey there, just passing through. Nothing to see here?" A few seconds later, a squirrel darted out of the bushes and scampered away. Relieved, I continued hiking, only to hear another rustle, this time behind me. I turned around and saw the actual culprit, a deer. It stared at me like it was personally offended by my existence before trotting off. Now, every time I see a "Beware of Bears" sign, I take it a little more seriously. And maybe I don't yell at squirrels anymore. Story 114. I once tried to fix a leaky faucet by myself because I thought, how hard can plumbing be? Spoiler, it's very hard. I watched a YouTube tutorial, bought a wrench, and turned off the water supply like a responsible adult. Things were going great until I unscrewed the wrong part, and water started spraying everywhere. I scrambled to tighten it back, but the wrench slipped, and I ended up drenched. To make matters worse, my landlord stopped by to pick up rent while I was mid-crisis. He just stood there, watching me wrestle with the faucet, before calmly asking, "Need some help?" He fixed it in about 2 minutes, while I stood there looking like I'd just finished a water park ride. Now I call a plumber for anything more complicated than tightening a screw. Edit. Yes, I did manage to turn the water supply off again, after flooding half the bathroom. Never underestimate the power of professional tools. Story 115. A few months ago, I adopted a cat who, at first, seemed like the sweetest, most chill animal ever. On the second night, I woke up to a loud crash in the kitchen. I ran in to find my cat perched on top of the fridge, surrounded by shattered mugs and plates. Apparently, she'd figured out how to open cabinets. Thinking it was a one-time thing, I cleaned up the mess and went back to bed. The next morning, I walked into the living room to find that she'd somehow knocked over the TV remote, turned on the TV, and switched it to static. It was like living with a tiny poltergeist. Now, every cabinet in my house has child-proof locks, and I've learned to hide anything breakable. The cat still acts like she owns the place. Honestly, she might be right. Story 116. A few years ago, I went on a trip to a small town known for its quaint charm and antique shops. It sounded peaceful, but my experience was anything but. I was browsing through a dusty old store when I knocked over a vase. Not just any vase. It turned out to be a 19th century artifact worth $800. The shop owner looked like they were about to faint, and I was too stunned to speak. I offered to pay for it, but the owner shook their head and said, "No, it's fine. It's been cracked for years anyway." Relieved, I left the store, only to realize I'd left my wallet behind. When I went back, the owner handed it to me and added, "Maybe just stick to window shopping next time." Now, every time I see an antique shop, I give it a wide berth. Lesson learned. I'm not cut out for places where the merchandise is older than my great-grandparents. Story 117. I once decided to build a piece of furniture from scratch because I thought it would be a fun weekend project. I'd seen people do it on YouTube, and it didn't look that hard. Spoiler. It was very hard. The instructions I followed seemed straightforward, but by the end of day one, I'd somehow managed to put the legs on backward. Day two was spent fixing my mistakes, but the more I tried, the worse it got. By the time I finished, the table was wobbly, uneven, and looked like something you'd find in a kindergarten art class. My roommate came home, took one look at it and said, "Is it supposed to look like that?" I ended up buying a table from IKEA the next week. Now, when people ask me about DIY projects, I just say, some things are better left to the professionals. Story 118. One time, I accidentally sent a text meant for my best friend to my boss. It wasn't anything too embarrassing, just a rant about how much I hated mornings and needed coffee to function. But my boss replied with, "Noted. Maybe don't schedule meetings before 10 a.m." I was mortified. The next day, I apologized, and they laughed it off, saying they'd done worse. But from then on, they always brought up coffee in our meetings, like, "Have you had your caffeine today?" At first, it was funny, but after a while, it got old. Lesson learned. Always double check who you're texting. Also, maybe don't rant about mornings to anyone who controls your paycheck. Story 119. A few summers ago, I thought it'd be fun to try paddleboarding for the first time. It looked easy enough. All you do is stand on a board and paddle, right? Wrong. The second I got on, I wobbled like a newborn deer and immediately fell into the water. I kept trying, but every time I stood up, I'd lose my balance and splash down again. By the end of the hour, I was soaked, exhausted, and still hadn't managed to stand for more than 5 seconds. Meanwhile, kids half my age were zipping around on their boards like pros. When I got back to shore, the instructor said, "You'll get the hang of it next time." But there hasn't been a next time. Paddleboarding and I are officially not on speaking terms. Story 120. One night I was woken up by a strange noise in my apartment. It sounded like someone tapping on the window, which was weird because I live on the 3rd floor. My first thought was, great, it's either a ghost or Spider-Man. Armed with a broom, I tiptoed to the window and peeked out. Turns out it was a pigeon. Not just any pigeon. It had somehow gotten tangled in some string and was flapping around, creating a racket. I managed to scare it off, but not before it knocked over a potted plant on my balcony. The next morning, I cleaned up the mess and decided to move all my plants indoors. I still hear tapping sounds sometimes, but now I just assume it's another pigeon plotting its next chaotic visit. Edit. For those asking, no, I didn't try to untangle the pigeon. I value my fingers too much for that. I just hope it figured things out on its own. Story 121. A few years ago, I decided to get into jogging because everyone kept talking about how great it is for your mental health. I figured, why not? I laced up some old sneakers and hit the trail near my house. At first, it was fine. Birds were chirping, the air was fresh, and I felt like I could conquer the world. Then, about 5 minutes in, I realized I had wildly overestimated my fitness level. My lungs were on fire, my legs felt like lead, and I was sweating so much I looked like I'd just run a marathon in a sauna. I tried to keep going, but a couple walking their dog passed me at what felt like warp speed, and I had to stop. By the time I got home, I was so exhausted I just lay on the floor for 20 minutes. Now, whenever I hear someone rave about jogging, I nod politely and think, that's great for you, but I'll stick to walking, thanks. Story 122. One time I bought a houseplant because I thought it would make my apartment look more adult. I picked out a snake plant because the tag said it was low maintenance. Perfect, right? Well, apparently even low maintenance plants need some attention, because within a month it was drooping and turning yellow. I googled how to save a dying snake plant and learned that I'd been overwatering it. Feeling guilty, I stopped watering it altogether, and surprise, it got worse. By the time I figured out the right balance, it was basically a shriveled husk. I ended up replacing it with a fake plant, which still looks great to this day. Moral of the story, some people just aren't meant to have green thumbs, and that's okay. Story 123. A couple of summers ago, I went to a water park with some friends. One of the slides was this massive, near-vertical drop, and everyone dared me to try it. Not wanting to seem like a coward, I climbed to the top, heart pounding with every step. When it was my turn, the lifeguard gave me a thumbs up, and I forced a weak smile before launching myself down. Let me tell you, the feeling of free-falling while water shoots up your nose is not as fun as it looks in the commercials. By the time I reached the bottom, my swimsuit had shifted in ways that were not family-friendly, and I had to adjust it while trying to act like everything was fine. My friends were laughing so hard they couldn't breathe, and I spent the rest of the day sticking to the lazy river. Never again. Story 124. A few months ago, I decided to try meal prepping to save time and money. I bought a bunch of containers, researched recipes, and spent an entire Sunday cooking. By the end of the day, I had neatly portioned meals stacked in my fridge, and I felt like I had my life together for once. Then came Monday. I opened my lunch at work and the chicken was so dry it felt like eating sandpaper. On Tuesday, the rice was overcooked to the point of mushiness. By Wednesday, I couldn't even look at the food without gagging, so I caved and ordered takeout. Now, whenever someone mentions meal prepping, I just smile and say, "Yeah, I've tried it," while secretly knowing I'll never do it again. Edit. To everyone suggesting sauces and spices, I did use them, but apparently not enough to cover up my tragic cooking skills. Thanks for the tips, though. Story 125. Last winter, I decided to go ice skating with a group of friends. I hadn't skated since I was a kid, but I figured it would come back to me. Like riding a bike, right? Wrong. The moment I stepped onto the ice, I realized I had no balance. None. I spent the first 10 minutes clinging to the wall like it was a lifeboat. My friends tried to help, but every time they let go, I wobbled and nearly face-planted. Eventually, I worked up the courage to move away from the wall. I was doing okay, until a kid zoomed past me, causing me to panic and fall flat on my back. The worst part? The kid skated back, looked down at me and said, "Are you okay?" Like I was some helpless old person. By the end of the day, I was bruised, sore, and ready to never see another ice rink again. Lesson learned. Some childhood skills don't stick around forever.